So I wanted to share another clip with you from Noam Chomsky's interview with Democracy Now! Because they actually asked him about the Democratic Party's Russian hysteria, and throughout the course of his answer, I think he said everything that progressives have been saying since day one.
Noam Chomsky, I'd like to ask you about something that's been in the news a lot lately. Obviously, all the cable channels, that's all they talk about these days, is the whole situation of Russia's supposed intervention in American elections for a country that's intervened in so many governments and so many elections around the world. That's kind of a strange topic, but I know you've referred to this as a joke. Could you give us your view on what's happening and why there's so much emphasis on this particular issue?
It's a pretty remarkable fact that, first of all, it is a joke. Half of the world is cracking up in laughter. The United States doesn't just interfere in elections. It overthrows governments it doesn't like, institutes military dictatorships. Simply in the case of Russia alone, it's the least of it. The U.S. government under Clinton intervened quite blatantly and openly. They didn't try to conceal it to get their man Yeltsin in all sorts of ways. So this, as I say, it's turning the United States again into a laughingstock in the world. So why are the Democrats focusing on this? In fact, why are they focusing so much attention on the one element of Trump's programs, which is fairly reasonable, the one ray of light in this gloom, trying to reduce tensions with Russia? The tensions on the Russian border are extremely serious. They could escalate to a major terminal war. Efforts to try to reduce them should be welcomed. Just a couple of days ago, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, came out and said he just can't believe that so much attention is being paid to apparent efforts by the incoming administration to establish connections with Russia. I said, sure, that's just what they ought to be doing. So meanwhile, this one topic is the primary locus of concern and critique, while meanwhile the policies are proceeding step by step, which are extremely destructive and harmful. So, yeah, maybe the Russians tried to interfere in the election. It's not a major issue. Maybe the people on the Trump campaign were talking to the Russians. Well, okay, not a major point, certainly less than is being done constantly. And it is a kind of a paradox, I think, that the one issue that seems to inflame the Democratic opposition is the one thing that has some justification and reasonable aspects to it.
He states it's a joke and half the world is cracking up in laughter at us. That's exactly what I'm saying, because the thing about all of this Russian hysteria and how they supposedly influenced the elections by releasing true emails that should have been public in the first place, I mean, by saying that influenced the elections and for us to complain about it after the U.S. government has interfered in so many elections, I mean, look at Latin America. How many governments have we overthrown to instill dictatorships? So for us to complain about interfering with elections and foreign interference in our democratic process, I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. It's ridiculous. So I'm glad that he said this. Now, look, of course, that doesn't mean that I condone other countries interfering with our elections, but what they're saying that Russia did, which is supposedly tantamount to interfering with an election, I just don't buy it. I don't think that releasing these emails from WikiLeaks and John Podesta, if we can prove, which we can't at this point, that Russia did in fact do, I don't believe that that had a major influence on the election. And guess who agreed with me prior to the election? Democrats and the media. They said that there were no bombshells, that there was nothing in these emails, that WikiLeaks is trolling the world because they've released nothing on Hillary. But once we actually see that Hillary Clinton lost the election, well, now all of a sudden we want to worry about the extent to which these emails influenced the election. The media didn't cover these emails, so I don't think it had an impact on the election. I think that Hillary Clinton lost because she had a horrible campaign strategy. She didn't campaign in the Rust Belt. I mean, she didn't set foot in Wisconsin one time, hence why she lost in that state. So I don't think that these emails had an impact on this election. So, I mean, it's ridiculous to say that this influenced the election. So I kind of laugh when they complain about when the Democratic Party establishment and Republican warmongers like John McCain and Lindsey Graham talk about how much these emails interfered with the election. I don't think it had an impact in the election, and if it did, it was probably very, very tiny. Now, another excellent point that I think he made is he talks about how Democrats are taking the one element from Donald Trump's platform that kind of makes him more desirable, or at least did up until this point, which is him trying to de-escalate tensions between the United States and Russia, and they're trying to paint that as the worst aspect of Donald Trump's presidency, when we should be de-escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia, because if you look at the border, I mean, we are having NATO troops perform military exercises, like Noam said, just yards away from Russia's border, and this is an act of aggression. This is what we're doing. And furthermore, when you look at the media and how they're covering the story, I mean, Rachel Maddow contends that if Trump withdraws troops from the NATO borders and just stops being aggressive, well, then that must prove that he's a puppet of Putin. So, I mean, I think that it's important that we talk about how trying to escalate tensions between the United States and Russia at a dangerous time, it's very reckless. So now we have a highly respected academic saying what the Democratic Party is doing, it's very dangerous. We have someone that's an unhinged madman like Donald Trump. This is what the Democratic Party contends. They say he's unhinged. He's not suited to be president. This was basically the thesis of Hillary Clinton's campaign, yet they want to push him to be tougher on Russia. They're trying to egg on an escalation of tensions between the United States and Russia. So it's ridiculous, and I'm so glad that Noam said what progressives have been saying since the beginning of this Russian hysteria. Now, he was also asked why he thinks it's the case that the Democratic Party is doing this, why they're pushing this over policies, and here's what he had to say.
Well, you can understand why the Democratic Party managers want to try to find some blame for the fact, for the way they utterly mishandled the election and blew a perfect opportunity to win, handed it over to the opposition. But that's hardly a justification for allowing the Trump policies to slide by quietly, many of them not only harmful to the population, but extremely destructive, like the climate change policies. And meanwhile, focus on one thing that could become a step forward if it was adjusted to move towards serious efforts to reduce growing and dangerous tensions right on the Russian border, where they could blow up. NATO maneuvers are taking place hundreds of yards from the Russian border. The Russian jet planes are buzzing American planes. Something could get out of hand very easily. Both sides are, meanwhile, are building up their military forces, adding the U.S. is one thing that the Russians are very much concerned about is the so-called anti-ballistic missile installation that the U.S. is establishing near the Russian border, allegedly to protect Europe from non-existent Iranian missiles. Nobody seriously believes that. This is understood to be a first strike threat. These are serious issues. People like William Perry, who has a distinguished career and is a nuclear strategist and is no alarmist at all, is saying that we're back to this is one of the worst moments of the Cold War, if not worse. That's really serious, and efforts to try to calm that down would be very welcome. And we should bear in mind it's the Russian border. It's not the Mexican border. There's no Warsaw Pact maneuvers going on in Mexico. And that's a border that the Russians are quite reasonably sensitive about.
Now, he really goes into detail about what we're doing, and whenever I talk about the acts of aggression that we're committing to try to egg on Russia and escalate tensions with Russia, people will say, well, Mike, I mean, come on, this isn't going to lead to a war, we just need to show strength. But we're beyond showing strength, we're just being aggressive. If you line up troops on the Russian border and you perform military exercises, that's an act of aggression. I mean, imagine if Russia was doing this in Mexico. Noam makes this point. Imagine if Russia was performing military exercises right up on the U.S. border in Mexico. We would consider this an act of war. I mean, we considered him releasing emails allegedly an act of war. So this is beyond showing strength. We are just being aggressive right now. And I mean, that doesn't suggest that Russia or Vladimir Putin is innocent, but I mean, we can only influence his actions so much, but we have direct control over our own actions, and it's incumbent on our elected officials not to create a new Cold War. But when I point this out, the response on Twitter or YouTube sometimes is, hey Mike, why don't you say hi to Putin for me because he's apparently your buddy. It's just, this is the new McCarthyism. Anyone who doesn't agree with this Russian narrative, they are painted as a shill for the Kremlin or a buddy of Vladimir Putin. Well, I've never met Vladimir Putin. I don't particularly like Vladimir Putin. I think he's an anti-gay authoritarian dictator, and I don't support that. But what I am saying is I don't want a war with Russia. I don't think that this would benefit anyone, Russians or Americans. So I'm looking out for our own interests, and I'm trying to pursue peace. But when you see an alliance being formed between neoconservatives and neoliberal Democrats, well, that's when you have to worry, because we're not talking about showing strength. Like I said, we're talking about brazen acts of aggression that our government is doing. Now, Noam Chomsky quoted William Perry, who said, we're back to some of the worst moments of the Cold War, if not worse. And when I heard him say that, this was something that honestly sent chills down my spine, because I've constantly talked about the need to stop with the Russian hysteria because we're going to catalyze a new Cold War. But I think we're past the point where we're talking about the prospect of a new Cold War. Certainly after Donald Trump launched missiles on Syria, I think we're in a new Cold War. I think that we need to stop talking about it as if it's something that's going to happen and start referring to the reality of the situation. When you have NATO troops performing exercises on the Russian border, when you have Trump bombing an ally of Russia, when you have both parties beating the war drums, when you have the media working in tandem with the political establishment to take military action against one of Russia's allies, we are in a new Cold War. I think it's official. So when I say that Democrats need to stop with the Russian hysteria, I'm not saying it because I'm a Kremlin shill. I've never been to Russia. I don't really care about Russia. I just want peace in the world. But if the United States and Russia go to war with each other, that will destabilize not just those two countries. That will destabilize the entire world. We're talking about World War III. So this is dangerous, and I am so thankful that Noam Chomsky took the time to tell it like it is on this issue, even if people are now inevitably going to accuse him of being a Russian shill.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.